Diving straight into the action here, and I'm taking the caliper off the front of the Ibiza. As you can see, there's a nasty mark marked all over the brake disc, and this has been caused by something on the brake caliper. Now, on closer inspection of the carrier, you can see that the inside clip that holds on the brake pads, this has been catching on the brake disc at the same time. So it might seem a bit rough, but I've just decided to cut off those wee tabs completely so they're not encroaching into the side of the brake disc. Then a quick clean up with the wire brush to make sure the brake pads sit nice and loosely in those parts. And a wee bit of copper grease then, just to make sure the brake pads move freely in these clips. I'm sure someone below is going to mention in the comments that I shouldn't be using copper grease, but it's been no issue for me whatsoever. And by the looks of it now, there's a wee bit of a gap between the brake disc and that carrier, so hopefully there'll be no more scratching noise on that brake disc. How's it going? You're probably watching me right now trying to tackle that front left-hand wheel, make sure that noise disappears completely. But just to let you know about today's video, I have got a host of other issues with the Ibiza that I've written down here on my phone. So we've got an accelerator pedal that I've actually already fixed, and I'll explain what I did there with that. That was quite a straightforward fix. Knocking on bumps, so when going around town, I'm getting various knocking off the engine area. I'm not too sure where it's coming from exactly. Knocking when changing gear, so it could be related to that. I think maybe the gearbox mount might be on its way out, so I have got a new gearbox mount sitting there to go on, so that hopefully will solve that issue. I've still got a knocking from the exhaust, so I'm looking to put the car up on some ramps so the car is sitting in its usual on the road position, and then look to see where the exhaust sits to see if I can somehow get it to miss the rear axle. That's what's happening, is the rear axle is now sitting so close to the exhaust because I've slammed it on coilovers, and it's now just gently tapping away on the exhaust, which gets quite annoying. I've had an ongoing issue with the tracking and alignment on the Ibiza. Now, I thought it was the steering rack on its way out, but looking into a few forums, they actually say the inner track rod ends, they tend to wear out. I've got two new track rod ends, again, sitting there. Hopefully they sort the issue. And if it doesn't fix the issue, then yes, the next option then is to actually sort the steering rack itself, which is obviously quite expensive. Audio controls, so I bought, where are they? In my pit of spares. So yeah, I did buy a kind of wiring harness canvas system. This is to allow the wheels on the steering wheel to work with the aftermarket stereo that's in the car. It's just a cheap Alpine unit. It's been there obviously for a number of years, but it just is quite annoying when you're changing, when you want to change the volume or change tracks, you can't use the steering wheel controls. So hopefully that will sort that. And then finally, I've got this annoying knock in the driver's door whenever I close it. I know exactly what the issue is, and you'll find out. It's something stupid, but you'll find out at the end of the video what exactly is causing that knock in the driver's door. Looking under the engine, you can see that I seem to still have an oil leak of some sorts. It's coming down the back of the engine, probably from the rocker cover gasket. It must be still leaking, obviously, but it's no way as bad as it used to be. Just now I haven't got time to look into that any further. Anyway, this knocking noise. Going around the anti-roll bar links here, and I was actually fortunate enough to kind of locate the noise straight away. Moving the anti-roll bar up and down by holding it itself, and then shaking it, I could hear this gentle tapping noise, as you can hear in the video. Did try other bits as well, just to make sure there wasn't a noise coming from somewhere else that maybe was the main culprit, but nothing else seemed to be the issue. So these drop links were the main cause, I believe, and I was just going to get them tightened up because I could tell that the top nut clearly wasn't nipped up properly at all. A quick test run then to make sure that the knocking had gone away. Knocking noise sorted, and scraping noise, it was actually scraping on the way out there slightly, but it's sorted now as well. Oh, how's it going? Thank you. Cheers. The knocking noise is sorted now. It's such a stupid thing that I did, fitting them and not actually tightening both nuts up. So the bottom one was done, but the top one obviously there was loose, and that's what was making a wee bit of play up and down the threads on the short and drop links. Drove it out the road, heated the brakes up, because usually it's when metal expands, when it's a bit warmer, that's when you definitely hear the scraping as you're turning right onto the driveway there, and it was perfectly quiet. So glad that's boxed off. Now I'm going to tackle the gearbox mount. Hopefully then at the same time I can check the area where the gear linkage is mounted as well, and see what that annoying clonking noise is whenever I'm going from like first into second or third or down the gears as well. As an annoying clonking noise. I hope it's something like a bracket and not the gearbox itself. If it is the gearbox itself, I'll just have to get used to that noise because I'm not replacing the gearbox. So to get to the top of the gearbox mount and the gear linkage itself, there's quite a few things to move out of the way. So you've got the battery cover, the battery itself, then the battery tray, and all the air intake parts as well. As usual, I dropped the battery retaining clip down the front behind the headlight, and I had to go and get that later on. So looking at the gear linkage, first of all, there's a wee bit of knock, a bit of play here as it's moving back and forwards, and it's coming from this kind of plastic clip that goes inside the sliding section of the gear linkage. So I decided to pull the clips out and to see what this plastic bit was actually doing. It did look a bit worn and there was a lot of gunk on it, so I kind of cleaned that up. Once that was cleaned up, I also then put a cable tie. This is a bit rough, but I put a cable tie around the mechanism to take up the slack for just now, and I ordered a new one online. Now these from the UK with short postage times were extortionate compared to the price of Autodoc, which is about £1.50, but I did have one on order for a few quid, and that is on its way. But for just now, this cable tie fix might fix the knocking noise, I'm not too sure yet. Quick test then to make sure it's still changed gear, no bother. Cut the excess of the cable tie off, and now on to the gearbox mount. Just making sure the gearbox mount does match up to the new one that I've got before taking it all apart. I forgot to show here that I'm actually jacking up the bottom of the engine with a trolley jack just to make sure it's holding the weight of the engine before I take this mount off, because obviously once I take the mount off, the engine wants to fall down out the bottom of the car if there's no support there for it. Definitely the new one feels a lot firmer than the old one. Whether this will fix the knocking noise altogether, I'm not too sure, but it's worth changing anyway because the old one is about 17 years old now. Wee bit of WD-40 into the holes to make sure the screws went back in okay, and it took a wee bit of sugarling to get the gearbox lined up to make sure all the bolts went back into the original holes. Then just replacing everything back into the engine bay, including the air intake system, and that was another job done. Delivery of my new ramps just arrived. You can see them set down just there against the wall, so I'll get them unwrapped later on. Next up was to fix this small gap between the exhaust and the rear axle. Now whenever I'm going over bumps, these come into contact with each other. Sometimes the exhaust just rests on the rear axle and the vibrations come through the car quite a lot. Also looking at the exhaust tips as they come at the bumper, they have now started to settle back against the side of the rear bumper, which isn't ideal. I had to get the back box off, so I released the clamp and then I sprayed WD-40 all over the rubber mounts to try and get them to come out easier, which they still weren't the easiest things to get off. But I finally got there and then pulled off the back box. Cleaning up the part of the exhaust that seems to be contacting the rear axle, I could find roughly about where on the exhaust exactly it was happening, and this was then the part for my next plan. So with some heat outside and in a kind of safety controlled environment, if you want to call it, I heated up the exhaust and then I laid into it with a plastic hammer. Not ideal, it's not really affected the performance of the exhaust, I'm sure, by having these little flat spots. But this was the only way I thought of actually solving this for a long term and getting it over the top of the back axle without it coming into contact with it. Some water then to cool it down before handling it, and then back on the car I used this rag to keep a space around top of the exhaust tips so they lined up properly as I was fitting the rest of the exhaust back onto the car. As you can see as well, the back axle and exhaust seem to have a lot bigger gap between them now. I'm not sure how long that will last, but for just now that looks like a successful job. So a few jobs ticked off there now finally on the car. Quite a substantial gap now between the rear axle beam and the exhaust. I don't think I hammered it that flat when I was heating up, but maybe I've just repositioned it. I hung it back on the hangers, maybe I've just put it in the right position. We'll see what it's like over the next few days once it settles. A few heat cycles, a few times the car bouncing around, maybe it will set onto a different position, but just now it looks like it's got a good gap, definitely a big gap now around the top of the valance on the back of the bumper, and there seems to be quite a substantial gap between the exhaust and the rear beam, so maybe that will be completely quiet now. I think at worst now all that's going to happen is the exhaust might bump off the bottom of the car instead, but when it was lying on that rear beam and it was vibrating away comes the engine vibrations, it was so annoying. It would just come through the whole frame of the car. So I'm glad that's finally got a bit of space now. As for the next few jobs, I'm going to give it a pause for just now and put the car outside on the drive, because as you can see it's getting a little bit darker and I need to bring that quick lift jacks inside the garage and get them unpacked. I've ordered the hydraulic oil to put in them. That should come in a couple of days time, so I can't actually raise or lower them until I get the hydraulic oil. But I want to get them in here, get them unpacked, make sure it's all okay, and then possibly good weather again tomorrow by the sounds of it, so I'll have the car out on the drive and I'll probably just do a lot of jobs on the driveway, including the audio system, get with these inner track rod ends, get them sorted out as well, and I've forgotten what else, but it'll be on that list anyway. So with the pickup mix at hand, it was time to tackle the audio system on the car. I bought this new system, of course, separately, which I had to plug into the car, and there was some of the green wires I had to remove completely because I got an Alpine head unit. Now I had bought this special pin assortment to try and remove the connectors, but like a Hollywood blockbuster film, I just decided to cut the green wire. I then did cover it with heat shrink just to make sure the ends didn't come into contact with anything else at any point. Now in the car, I did look in the glove box, and luckily the head unit case was there with the pins to remove it, so that made this a lot easier as well. Nothing worse than trying to get these things out without the correct pins for them. Pop them down each side and just drag it forward, and there you go. Once that's out of the way, it's just going to carefully remove the old connectors from the back of the head unit without catching them too much on the cage, because that's how they can get stripped or broken. And then looking into the back of the head unit space, I can actually see something that I wasn't expecting to see in there. Yes, there's another connector, exactly like the thing I've just bought, at the back of here. Now, come to think of it, there was actually a receipt that I found a while ago that did relate to something to do with the car stereo, but I wasn't aware it was one of these control units. Anyway, I'm going to put my one in just because I know it's brand new and it will work, and then I'll keep the other one just in case. It probably does work as well, but for some reason it's maybe disconnected over the years, and that's why it wasn't working at the time. I use this cable tie here to hold these connectors together because one of the clips was actually broken, so it would come loose over time as well. Then back cable management to try and get them to tuck to the back of the head unit without them being in the way, because nothing worse than pushing the head unit back in. It doesn't fit because it's squashing all the wires at the back of it. Then just a quick test to make sure the head unit worked with the steering wheel controls before I put it all back together. Nothing worse than putting something back together and finding out you've done something wrong, so this is the best time to catch it. But fortunately it all worked perfectly. I did have a small hiccup where I put it all back together after testing this and it wasn't working at all, no power. I checked all the fuses, it wasn't them. I then took it back out and found out I'd somehow snagged a wire and snapped the main power wire. So once that was soldered back together again, it all worked perfectly. I forgot to actually explain to you what was going on with this pedal. So this is the old one on the car. The new one I've got actually has got a Roomster written there, so it was a second-hand one off Skoda Roomster. I think it's like an SUV type thing from Skoda. So you can see the Bosch part number there, which was on this old one. Use that for a cross-reference, and that was exactly the same one that came off the Roomster. Now, pretty straightforward to change over actually. Just remove a bit of trim from underneath the dashboard to kind of get a bit more access to the multi-plug that sits on the top here. Supposedly there's sometimes different number of pins, so you just got to make sure you get the right number of pins. If you get the right part number, you're going to get the right unit itself, so that's the main part. Get that part number there rather than having to check these pins, and you'll get the right unit. Then after that, there is two nuts on the top that hold on. So there's, on the frame of the car, there's two bolts that stick out the bottom of the car, the footwell, and they'll then just slot through here. Pop two nuts on the top, and then there's one more nut on the bottom down there as well. What I would say though is you'll find that these two are quite awkward to get the nuts off of, especially this inner one here. So there's a lot of wires and cabling off the wiring loom that kind of hangs down in the way here. So you need a long extension, you need a 10mm socket, and yeah, various extensions to try and poke your way all through the wiring loom to then get the nut on top of the threaded bolt that sticks through. So yeah, just be aware that if you're ever changing these in the future, that will be the awkward bit when you're changing them over. So you want to know the reason I actually changed this over. So quick explanation is that when I would pull up to a junction or set of traffic lights, the car was always like revving like about 1200 revs. So I'd put my foot under the base of the pedal and lift it back up, and that would bring the revs back down to a normal idling speed. So it was like the sensor inside was gone, or it wasn't springing back to its fully like reset position. Sometimes as well it would be very on-off with the acceleration, so it wouldn't be you couldn't just tap the accelerator very gently and it would accelerate smoothly. It would be you push it, nothing, and then suddenly you'd get the engine like responding and kicking into life. So it was like a very on-off style accelerator pedal rather than a kind of smooth and gradual one. So you couldn't feed in throttle gradually because, again, I think it's something to do with the sensors inside here, electronics, were just meaning that it was kind of giving an on-off signal altogether. It wasn't as bad as it makes that sound, but it just wasn't a very smooth driving experience. With the second-hand one I put in just now, for the moment, it might do the same as well in the future, but for the moment just now, it's a lot smoother to drive. Now the dreaded task of these inner track rod ends. Taking off the top nut for the tie rod is pretty straightforward, then you just screw it back on a little bit before you tap it with a hammer to dislocate it from the hub. Then, because the rubber boots were pretty knackered anyway, I just decided to cut away at these to reveal then the inner track rod part that I had to unscrew to get them off the car. Once they were exposed, I then tried to use this tool that I bought ages ago to help take off inner tie rods, but it was no use at all. There was a lack of space around it to get proper leverage to get it off. So the next thing I tried then was just to get some sort of span around it. Again, this wasn't working very well either. So in the end, the only thing I decided to do was to lower the wishbone. So taking off the ball joint beside the hub first, and then taking off the bolt on the left hand side of the wishbone, and then slowly pushing it down to try and release it from the car. Thankfully this worked and gave me way more access to getting my adjustable spanner onto the end of the inner tie rod, and finally loosen it from the car. I then attempted to get them both adjusted correctly so that the new inner tie rod was set at the same length as the old one to make sure the tracking wasn't too far out, and then installed it on the car, along with these brand new rubber boots. Now these rubber boots came with new metal clips, and as you can see the large metal clip was really hard to access from under the car. There was no way for me to squeeze it to tighten up properly where it was. Sadly then I had to resort to the good old fashioned thick plastic cable tie to hold this boot in place. What a pain getting those inner tie rod ends off. You might have seen in the video there that the original ones, I think the original ones that are on the car, just had two flat sides and they weren't hexagonal like the ones I got replacements, so you really had to kind of get in there properly on those two flat sides with a spanner, and it was really awkward. Taking down the wishbones does help, not ideal though, and then I've got a really bad knock in the car now. When I lift off the accelerator and the car lurches forward, there's a knock. I think I fixed it now because I forgot to put weight down on the wishbones as I tightened the wishbone bolt back in. So I've done that now. I've put the bolts back in with weight on the wheels, and hopefully that's now settled everything back into place and it's not clonking anymore. We'll find out tomorrow when I put the car back on the road. Anyway, last job to do, an annoying knock in the driver's door, which I know exactly what it is. Let's go and get that sorted. So if you followed the channel for a wee while now, you might know that I've wrapped this Ibiza myself a number of months ago. And when I was wrapping it, I had to have the door cards off at certain points. Now, this driver's door card was off when I was doing the wrap, and I had to reinstall it back onto the car in the pitch dark out in the driveway one night when it came to the end of me wrapping the car. It was all finished off. I managed to get the door card back on, then lock the car and walk away from it, pitch dark at night on my driveway. And I turned back briefly to look at the car and spotted this weird glow coming out the bottom of the door. I finally now have my LED lamp back now, so if you've enjoyed the content, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll catch you next video. Cheers.